All right, we should be live on our social media channels. Welcome everyone to this fine Friday. We are here with Carrie George from Kent State University, and she's going to be leading us through the What to Do with Memory Writing to Heal Poetry workshop. We're going to start off with a land acknowledgement, and we're just going to see if folks are joining in. Yes, okay. Okay, beautiful people are starting to join in the webinar. Welcome everyone that's joining us on the webinar, and welcome everyone that's seeing this live on social media as well. We acknowledge that the land that we are meeting on is the traditional territory of the many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. We acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. Thank you again and welcome everyone. I'm just going to introduce Carrie, and I'm going to bring her on the screen here. All right, so everyone can see. So Carrie George is a Master of Fine Arts candidate for poetry in the Northeast Ohio MFA program. She's a graduate fellow at the Wick Poetry Center, where she teaches poetry writing workshops throughout the community. She's a Pushcart Prize nominee, and her work has appeared on poets.org and in journals including Peach Magazine, Cosmonauts Avenue, and the Indianapolis Review. Welcome, Carrie. I'm going to pass it on to you to get us started today. Super excited. And welcome everyone that's in the room.
Thank you so much, Maria, for that introduction and for the land acknowledgement. I'm joining you all from Akron, Ohio, in America. So I'm on different land. I'm sorry I don't have a land acknowledgement for Akron, but thank you for the one for Toronto. So as Maria said, I work at the Wick Poetry Center, which is a poetry center in Kent, Ohio at Kent State University. And one of the things that we do at the Wick Poetry Center is think about poetry as a way of bringing community together, as a way of healing or unifying, or expressing ourselves in different ways. So we have lots of different projects, including Poets for Science, which investigates intersections of poetry and science, Armed with Our Voices, which investigates intersections of social justice and poetry. And one of our larger projects is Healing Stanzas, which talks about the healing properties and the healing powers of poetry, which is what I'm going to talk to you all about today, healing through poetry. Specifically healing over traumatic instances, traumatic experiences, including childhood sexual assault. So the poem that I will be sharing with everybody is a little bit triggering. So if at any point you need to leave the chat, leave the webinar, I completely understand. You have to do what's good for your mental health. So please keep that in mind. But I'd like you to consider whether or not you have writing experience or poetry experience, how you might relate this to your own healing journey, how you might take these conversations with you outside of this, for your own self or for people that you work with, people that you know, whether you have clients or just family members or friends with these experiences, how poetry and expressive writing might be something that you take with you past this webinar. So if there are any questions throughout, please feel free to put them in the chat. Questions, comments, confusions, I'd be happy to answer them. And then there will be a period throughout this webinar where we all stop and have a moment to respond with our own writing. So I will stop talking and you will have a chance to write on your own, and I'll give you a prompt and some guidance for that. So I can go ahead and begin by reading a poem for everybody. And I will go ahead and share my screen in just a moment. The poem is by a poet, Dianelli Antigua, who is a Dominican American poet. So there are some references to like American TV shows in the poem. And again, it deals with the subject of childhood sexual assault. So it might be triggering for some, but you'll see why we are talking about it. So hopefully everybody can see my screen now. I'm getting a nod from Maria. The poem is called Picked. As I watch a man steal fruit on the corner of Myrtle Ave and Broadway, I want to know what to do with the memory. Days of the week underwear, the hand cupping the small cones over my gray t-shirt, feeling for the raised tip, pink eraser bud, not yet brown. I tried to remember what was on TV. My sister's back to us, her flipping the channels, the screen turning black for a second in between Fox News, This Old House, and Wishbone. Maybe he touched me to reruns of the Brady Bunch. How I never trusted the father in a room with them, the girls, especially Cindy, with the blonde pigtails, her blue stare like knowing her weight, light enough to hold down with just a forearm. It didn't matter that it was Tuesday in August. He played with the planets on the edge of my cotton briefs, the rings of Saturn for Saturday. Mars was for Tuesdays. Mars was for Wednesday mornings and sometimes Wednesday afternoons before someone told me to shower. Mars was for spilled Hawaiian punch on Jupiter or laundry days on Mercury. Mars was for me in the mirror, when I'd push aside the fabric and see the sprouts of fuzz, black stubble of strawberry in the thief's hand, rubbing the skin with a dry finger. How hungry to steal just one. The melons would have told, I'm sure. I think sometimes it's helpful to hear poems more than once. So if you'll allow me to read it again, I think it allows us to really see everything that's happening in the poem. And there's a lot happening in this piece, especially if you aren't familiar with reading poetry. So I'll go ahead and read it twice just to give us all time to think about everything and notice all of the details throughout. Picked. As I watch a man steal fruit on the corner of Myrtle Ave and Broadway, I want to know what to do with the memory. Days of the week underwear, the hand cupping the small cones over my gray t-shirt, feeling for the raised tip, pink eraser bud, not yet brown. I try to remember what was on TV. My sister's back to us, her flipping the channels, the screen turning black for a second in between Fox News, This Old House, and Wishbone. Maybe he touched me to reruns of the Brady Bunch, how I never trusted the father in a room with them, the girls, especially Cindy, with the blonde pigtails, her blue stare like knowing her weight, light enough to hold down with just a forearm. It didn't matter that it was a Tuesday in August. He played with the planets on the edge of my cotton briefs, the rings of Saturn for Saturday. Mars was for Tuesdays. Mars was for Wednesday mornings and sometimes Wednesday afternoons before someone told me to shower. Mars was for spilled Hawaiian punch on Jupiter or laundry days on Mercury. Mars was for me in the mirror, when I'd push aside the fabric and see the sprouts of fuzz, black stubble of strawberry in the thief's hand, rubbing the skin with a dry finger. How hungry to steal just one. The melons would have told, I'm sure. Thank you for listening to that poem twice. If anything stands out to you about the poem, or if you have any questions about the poem, feel free to put them in the chat. And I would love to address those. But I'll also talk a little bit about what's going on in the poem, some things that stand out to me when I read it. The first thing that stands out, oh, someone already asked me that. Thank you, Arthur, for your question. When we're writing about trauma, it can be really hard to find an entry point. To write about something that is deeply meaningful to us or deeply difficult to talk about or to put into words. So what Antigua does here is she starts with something entirely different. She starts with an image of a man stealing fruit. And then that becomes an entry point into something that was stolen from her. So I'll read in a moment before we start writing some words from the poet about the experience of writing this poem. But she talks a little bit about that as well, how she saw this man steal fruit, and she wrote it down, but she didn't know what would become of it. She just thought it was an interesting thing that she saw. And then suddenly, like in writing, it became this journey into her experiences. So one thing to think about perhaps you're in this webinar because you've been wanting to write about something that's happened to you and you haven't known how. One thing to think about is not starting from the experience, but starting somewhere else. Do you remember what was on TV, or do you remember your surroundings? Do you remember the people who were around you? Do you remember a detail from the time of your life? Antigua talks about the days of the week underwear with the planets on them. So this isn't just for something that happened to you in your childhood. It can be for anything that we're taught when we're talking about poetry, anything that you want to write about. Another thing to think about is, how can we paint this picture for everybody else reading the poem? So what details can we use? Oh, I see someone raised his hand. I'm not sure how to click on that while I'm sharing my screen. Just a moment. Or is it gone now? Maybe that was just an accident. If you have a question, you can also use the chat. That might be easier for me. So how can we use details and images to communicate the story to other people? So she uses really vivid descriptions of all of these things that have happened. So it's not just Cindy, it's Cindy with the blonde pigtails, Cindy with her blue stare. So these colors, these sense images that help paint the picture, help draw you in with really specific aspects and really specific details of what's going on. And then as she closes the poem, she brings it back to the image of the theft. So we might think that if we enter the poem with one thing and end up with another thing, that it might be hard to end the poem or to tie it all together. But she does so in just a couple of lines. She brings it back very quickly. Black stubble of strawberry in the thief's hand, rubbing the skin with the dry finger, how hungry to steal just one. And in that moment, what we kind of see is the thief in the beginning becoming the thief of her childhood. The two things start to merge together. And she does that really expertly. But that's not something that we have to do. She's a very profound published poet. So she has a lot of practice with this. And poetry is practice. So if you have any questions about the poem, you can continue thinking about them. And I'm going to read for you what she sent me. I reached out to her because I think sometimes when we experience these poems about trauma, or when we write these poems about trauma, there's a danger of re-triggering ourselves if we don't do it the right way. First of all, we want to make sure that we're ready to talk about the poems, we're ready to write about the poems or the experiences. But also, even if we think we're ready, something might come up for us or something might be difficult. So I wanted to hear from her why writing this poem was important and what the process for writing this poem was, so that I could share it with all of you as well. So I'll read this, and then if there are any questions about her description or the poem, I'd be happy to talk about those as well. On the Writing of Picked by Dianelli Antigua. For almost 2 decades, I had been trying to write a poem about my sexual abuse trauma, but it was difficult for me to access the part of my brain that could write about this topic in a poetic way. I often found myself very much the little girl again, frozen and unable to speak. My poem, Picked, starts with a random observation. As I watched a man steal fruit on the corner of Myrtle Ave and Broadway, because I did indeed witness a man stealing fruit from Mr. Kiwi's fruit stand on my walk home from the subway one day after work. I quickly wrote it down in my notes, never imagining this would be my way into writing the poem. But this is how I live my life, perpetually writing down observations because I know this is how my poems are born. When I sat down to write this particular observation in mind, I didn't know at first where I would be headed. Trauma often works this way. Something small, something seemingly innocent can bring it all back, leaving me feeling out of control. But by choosing my own triggering entrance, I had control of the narrative. Though I could not change the past, I was gifting myself the agency to explore it on my own terms. Using an external event outside my trauma felt like a safer approach in which to discuss it. As I started writing, I was surprised at the connections I discovered between the memory and witnessing this small theft of the strawberry. Was I just a small theft to my abuser? I would never know the answer to that question, but it was a question that still required my investigation. As a survivor, what could I do with this memory? And what was my responsibility to my present self and the little girl? It was an important part of my healing process to write this poem as both the poet and the survivor. I could not separate the two. So I created a space in which both could be present, a space in which language and truth both mattered. So I think a lot of what she's saying here talks about the importance of healing in writing, and healing in poetry, especially. I think poetry holds a lot of room for what she says, which language and truth both matter. We can experiment with language, we can play with imagery in a way that makes the writing perhaps fun or experimental, or writing around things that are difficult. Whereas if we're just writing an essay or a journal entry, there's an implication that you're going to write things exactly as they happened in a step-by-step or chronological manner. And sometimes that can be difficult, especially when we're writing about trauma. So with poetry, there's places where you can veer away and then come back. And that's really good for us in our emotional journeys as we're writing, to take a step away and then to take a step back. So I see there's a question in the chat. Is this a question or an observation? Not necessarily starting with specific details of incident. This speaks about the power of trust and faith in the process, being guided by deep feelings and listening to one's heart. Yeah, thank you, Sabra. That's a really great observation. I love the idea of putting trust in the writing process. I think sometimes, especially when we write by hand, some part of our subconscious kind of drives the words out of us. So even if we're not thinking about it in the front of our brains, the emotions are there, and the experiences are there. So there's a trust, there's a letting go to the process of writing, that Antigua did here, starting with one observation and letting it lead into something else. So thank you for that observation. Are there any other questions about the poem or about Antigua's response to writing the poem? I would love to answer anything that has come up. If not, I'll also save some time at the end to answer questions about the poem or about writing in community settings or writing as healing in general. But I would love, if there aren't any questions, to have us all take some time to write our own poems, or if poem is a scary word for you, I can just say expressive writing. So I'll scroll down and I'll leave these prompts up on the screen so you can return to them. But I've brought a couple of thread statements. It's something that we use at the Wick Poetry Center. It's like the start of a poem, a thread or a stem, a place to begin. So the bolded words are your place to begin. And I'll go through them, but you can choose one of them and repeat it throughout the poem. So you could say, I want to know what to do with the memory of, and repeat several things that you want to know about. Or you can use all of these throughout the poem. You can play with a bunch of them. Or if the discussion that we've had has already sparked something and you're ready to write, then by all means, you can take it wherever you want to go. But I'll go through some of these little prompt stems for you. The first one is, I want to know what to do with the memory of, which I see as a very important hinge in Antigua's poem, because she has seen this occurrence, this man stealing something, and then is suddenly struck with a memory that she can't hold. She doesn't know what to do with it. And that's what really brings us into the trauma part of the poem. So if you are thinking, if this has brought something up, some kind of memory for you, you might think about it, how it's taken a long time for you to try to resolve this. It's something that's weighing on you, perhaps. Another thing you can think of is when I see blank, I remember blank. Sometimes with traumatic experiences, something will trigger us. Not just like the way we think of trigger, but also just it sparks a memory. It sparks a memory of something. So think of an image that a thing, an object, a person, a smell, a scent that causes some kind of memory, and allow that to continue in the rest of your poem. What else do you remember? What else is there? What happened next? What happened before? You might also think about what has been stolen from you. The way that this person stole the strawberry, or this person stole Antiqua's innocence or her happiness. And then on the other side of that, and this is part of where writing can become healing, what have you given back to yourself? What agency have you earned? What agency have you explored? Perhaps it's in the poem. As Antigua said, she was able to achieve agency in her exploration of this on her own terms. But what have you done on your own healing process to return something to yourself, something that might have been stolen? Or are there other people who have given you something that you didn't have for a long time? And then another little prompt, the last one that I have, is where it happened, there was blank. And this is simply describing the setting of your memory. That is sometimes easier than describing what actually happened. Describe what happened around it, and use as many details and experiences as you can. So what we always teach in starting to write poetry or expressive writing is to employ all of the senses. So what did you see? What did you hear? What might you have smelled? Was there a taste involved, or a touch, a feeling? So using all of those with any of these prompts can be really helpful to build an entire experience. So I invite you to take about 15 minutes on your own to do some writing using, as I said, these prompts, these explorations, or using something else if something else has come up for you in this discussion. I'll leave these on my screen, and Maria also shared them in the chat. So feel free to look for those. And if any questions come up, I will turn my screen off so I'm not distracting anybody, but if questions come up, I'll be looking at the chat so I can answer them in the chat. Are there any questions before we begin? This is very informal, so it's just supposed to be a chance for you to explore and to write on your own. Okay, go ahead and take your 15 minutes to respond to the prompts. And if questions come up, I will be monitoring the chat. Thank you. Okay, everybody, I'm gonna give you about another 3 to 5 minutes to finish up writing. You can always come back to this later. This can just be the start of something. If you would be interested in sharing a line or a sentence from what you wrote, I would love for you to put it in the chat and I can read some of them out loud. Just keep in mind, as Maria said, if you share your thoughts in the chat, your name will be visible to others, but it will not be visible on social media. So that's something that you can do in the next couple of minutes as well. Okay, we'll go ahead and stop there. I will stop sharing my screen. So I'd love to read these couple of lines that were put in the chat by all of you, and then I'd love to talk a little bit about the process of teaching these lessons and answer any questions. I see that there are a couple of questions in the chat. So thank you for those of you who shared some lines of your work in the chat. I'd love to read them. So one of them, if I can make sure I don't lose them. So someone put in the chat some lines from their piece, and it says, "My after is the uncleaned oven glass window caked with grease. It's the dim yellow bulb that illuminates the insides. It's the smell of cooking meals long burned, then crisped, then turned to carbon, dead and undying. That's just so lovely. The messiness and the dirtiness and how that changes to something that's dead and undying. You can really feel the tension and the violence, which is really powerful. Thank you so much for sharing that. And then we also had the beginning of someone's poem, a little lime green t-shirt with raised embroidery in 70s colors. And that's a beautiful entry. A word that sticks out to me is little, because that shows already that it's a small person that's going through whatever the situation will be. So that word is doing a lot of work, and it really takes us somewhere. The lime green, the 70s colors, it transports us to a time. So really beautiful. Thank you. And then I see one more was sent. So I'll read this one as well, and then I'll answer some questions. I don't know what to do with the memory of caged anger. I was just a child. I want to scream at the world. Why didn't you help me? Why did you smile and walk away? Why did you see the bruises and welts and go your way? In the dark, in the pain, fighting to breathe, silenced scream, caged in anger like a blackbird. Thank you for sharing that. Starting with the memory of caged anger is already such, like, what a memory. Caged anger, anger that can't escape. And then these questions are really profound, and returning to the image of anger like a blackbird. That was really well done. Thank you. It's amazing what everybody can do in such a short amount of time. Like, you all wrote these things in just 15 minutes. Thank you for those of you who shared. There were a couple of questions, but I'd like to talk to you first about how we do this at the Wick Poetry Center. So this lesson that I brought you through is kind of our typical way of teaching a poem, because we often teach to people who don't have writing or poetic experience. And so what we do is bring a poem with a singular idea or an access point that we can talk about as ourselves, not as poets, not as writers, but as people with experiences. So this poem, the access point for me is what to do with memory. And then after that, we discuss the poem. Usually we can have more of a discussion. Of course, I can't hear any of your voices. So sometimes that can help, that can unlock more things. And then we offer some prompts that help you explore your own ideas as well. So this is like and then sharing is also a really important part of our practice, because we like to hear what everybody else wrote, because it makes us feel more in community with each other. And it also gives us some support. You know, when we've written a hard thing, anything that we write is a hard thing to write, because writing is really vulnerable. Staring at a blank page is really difficult. Someone was talking about the deafening silence of writing. Everybody feels it. So to share is to celebrate for a moment that we've all been able to write something at all, which is such an accomplishment. So someone asked, I'm not a writer or a poet. Journaling has not been working. What are some guidelines, if any? So one of the guidelines for writing as a way of healing is, the first thing is to be easy on yourself, because as I said, any writing is an accomplishment. So if it's not coming out the way you want it to come out, don't try not to self-edit. Try to allow the words as they are in your head to come out onto the page. And perhaps in continuing to write, you'll get to the place where you want to go. Free writing is a great tool, just to continue to write without stopping. Like, don't let your hand stop, just keep writing. And then also, poetry can be a lot of different things. So try not to think about what you think poetry should be, and try to think about what you need from the writing. Why are you writing? Why are you telling your story right now? I don't know if that helps. Really, it's a practice. Just like with anything, you have to practice getting your thoughts out onto the page, and continue to do it until it's something that you become comfortable with. I'm losing the chat. Okay, there's a few things happening, so I'll read this one. I have from time to time wrote what I thought was poetry, only sharing on social media, only sharing my darkness and finishing in the light, and doing it just for my own satisfaction, maybe just to see what would people say. I never considered myself a poet, but what I have learned from you today and others, I will take it, sharing with the ones that matter. Thank you. That's lovely. Yeah, it's not about what you think poetry is. It's about why you're doing it for yourself. And I think Antigua showed that too in her poem and in her description of the poem. She didn't know what was coming of it, but she allowed the image to go where it needed to go for her. Well, let's see if there are any questions. What do you do around safety when asking folks to bring up difficult memories as inspiration for their art? That's a really good question. And I will say, when we're in the community, we don't always bring up prompts that are so explicitly tied to these emotions. This prompt I brought for you, I would not bring to a number of other places, but this is the nature of the conference. So I wanted to talk about it with everybody. But the one thing that we do is we make sure that we are honest with people. We don't want to mislead anybody saying, oh, we're just going to write some silly poems today, and then bring something that's really dark or really difficult to talk about. So setting up already the expectations and telling everybody exactly what's going to happen can really help people decide how they want to interact with the group. And then we don't often guide people to what they want to write about. When I asked you all to write about memory, because of the nature of the poem and the nature of what we're all talking about together in this conference, I was guiding you toward difficult memories. But of course, any memory is something worth exploring. Any memory at all, even if it's of family, like good memories, you can absolutely explore those. So we really try to leave it open-ended to the people, so we aren't forcing them into a place they don't want to go. Also not forcing anybody to share, just allowing people to share if they want to, because that's something that you sometimes have to work on your own, meet your own progress points for that. And it's also not suffering and difficult memories don't have to define art. Art can be a lot of things. Art can be joy, art can be happy memories. But when we're talking about healing, sometimes it's important to explore difficult memories in our own terms, in our own selves, so that we can have the space to do that and to work through those things. So it doesn't have to be, not all art has to come from suffering or from trauma, but art that heals sometimes does come from trauma, if that makes sense. But thank you, that was a really great question. I see a few more people put their poems in the chat, so that's lovely. Are there any other questions about the poem, about the prompt, about teaching poetry? Poetry is healing. I'd also love to share, I'll share a couple of links for everybody. I wanted to, what workshops does Wick Poetry Center offer that people can join in? So that's a great question. I'm going to send this into the chat for everybody to see. My email is there, so if you have any questions about what we talked about, you can reach out to me at that email. There are 2 links to buy Dianelli Antigua's book, Ugly Music. If the poem stood out to you, if this is something you're interested in reading more about, she has a lovely book. I put 2 links there for you. One is on Amazon, or one is bookshop.org, but I don't know if they ship internationally, but they are a great website that supports independent booksellers. And then the other one is Amazon, because they will ship to most places. And then I put the Wick Poetry Center's Traveling Stanzas website, which also includes Wick Poetry Center social media, which is where you could find our workshops that are available. Most of our workshops are local to Kent, Ohio, but we have international projects, thread prompts, and international poems that people from anywhere can contribute to. So please take some time to explore that website and our social media. That would be, if you're interested in poetry as a tool for the community or poetry as exploring different facets of life, we have a lot of those kinds of resources. So let me see, there were I'll answer this final question. I think this is a good question to end on. How do you finish the activity after writing a poem because it opens wounds and surfaces pain? And that's a great question. And that is a very difficult part of writing. And that's what I mentioned earlier about trying to avoid re-triggering ourselves. But oftentimes when we think of writing and healing, we think, okay, we write the poem, we write about our experiences, we've written a great poem, it's an awesome poem. And we think that that's an accomplishment on its own, and we write the poem and then we walk away. But a really important thing to do is to not think that that's it. The poem is not the end of your healing. And if you've dug up something like opening a wound or resurfacing pain, you might have to sit with that for a little bit before you get up and move on from your day. Maybe after you wrote the poem, if you're not feeling very well, you need to write another poem, or just free write about what's come up in your mind, what has reopened. If there are any other self-care practices that you have, if visual art is a self-care practice, you might paint or color. If taking a bath is a self-care process for you, you might hop in the bath for a little bit, light a candle, do some stretches. This is, as with any part of healing, it's not just one and done. And healing writing can be great because it helps us explore things that we aren't actively exploring, but then that can be difficult when we've uncovered something we weren't ready to uncover. So if that happened to you today, I think we're ending a little early. I don't know when the next session is, but I hope you'll have a little bit of time to, after this, shut your computer, do some deep breathing, or do some free writing or some journaling, read a book or something that you can do for yourself to get yourself centered and back in a place where you can then enter the world without doing so being re-traumatized or re-triggered. I hope that's helpful. It's always a risk, but I hope that what you uncovered or what you wrote in your poem was worth some of that feeling. And if not, then you know that this might not be for you, or you might have to wait a little bit until you try again. But as with everything, it's a practice and it's very individualized. So thank you all for being here with me today and for writing with me today. The poems that everybody shared were so wonderful. So I'm sure everybody else wrote wonderful things as well too. So thank you all so much for your bravery and your vulnerability and your great questions.
Thank you so much, Carrie, on behalf of the Gatehouse, for being here today and facilitating this wonderful workshop. Such powerful poetry being shared, and much love coming toward your way in the chat as well. Thank you everyone who has been watching on social media and participating in that way. And it is available on our YouTube channel. So if you go to the youtube.com/gatehouse, it's kind of flipped backwards on there, you'll find us there, and feel free to share on your social media pages. Again, on behalf of the Gatehouse, thank you so much, Carrie, for sharing your wisdom with us. Truly impactful. Have a safe and wonderful rest of your day, everyone. Our next workshop is at 1 o'clock, and we're talking about boundaries, both in English and in French, with Lucy Bruneau from Voice.